Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Tomorrow night, 8 Republicans will meet on the stage in Milwaukee for a debate. I am certain that China will come up, the Chinese Communist Party, but I'm not sure how. Bret, Baier, of course, coming up later in the program. Martha MacCallum, two superb professionals, the equal of anyone else in our business, will be asking the questions. But I thought I would talk it through with the chairman of the House Select Committee on Engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, Mike Gallagher. Congressman, good morning. Great to have you. Thank you for joining me.
It is great to be with you, Hugh.
We're going to come back around to this kind of war, which I finished last night on the recommendation of you. It is a remarkable book, and I had no idea how awful the Chi-Coms were to our American prisoners. I didn't know. Did you know that before? Did the Marines teach you that when you were in the Marines?
No, there's two things that I think, well, a lot of actually our modern thinking about how to prepare people for when they get captured. Think survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school, which I attended when I was in the Marine Corps, actually comes out of the experience of the Korean War, particularly some politically sensitive moments when a few American captives refused actually to go home. There was, of course, this controversy during that time period, post-Korean War in the 50s, about this idea of brainwashing. This is prominently expressed in the fictional book, The Manchurian Candidate, which became a major American movie. But a lot of our thinking about how to better prepare pilots in particular, because they get shot down, for resisting in captivity actually comes out of that period.
Well, a couple of takeaways I'll never forget. No Turks died in the camps. The Turks are the toughest people in the world, and none of them died in the Chinese Communist Party camps. And the Americans didn't eat everything they could eat because they didn't like it, and they died of starvation. But the fact that the Chinese communists treated our men that way is a tell, because they've reverted to this mode. They were the hardcore Maoist Leninist mode in 1950 through 1953, and they've reverted. And that's what I want to talk to you about. I wanted to ask you at length. We got a lot of time this morning, and thank you for the time. If you were advising Bret and Martha, based upon your 6 months, what would you tell them are the major takeaways that you've learned as the chairman of the Select Committee, and how would you suggest they be turned into a question? Take your time, because that's a big question. What have you learned thus far in 6 months, and how would you convert that into questions for our candidates?
Well, I think the overall thing to realize for these candidates, and this advice is worth what they're paying me for it, is that there is, in my opinion, something called the commander-in-chief test. It's not, you're not graded A through F. I think it's a pass-fail endeavor, but it is absolutely critical. Put differently, I'm not myopic enough to believe that foreign policy, or a particular issue of foreign policy, is going to win a candidate the election, but it could very well lose them the election. The final thing to say about the assumptions going into this when it comes to foreign policy is that the conventional wisdom is that it doesn't really matter from a political electoral perspective, and there's a lot of social science to support that. I just would say it doesn't matter until it does. It doesn't matter until things go haywire on the world stage, and suddenly voters are looking to a prospective commander-in-chief to communicate, if nothing else, a sense of safety, that I have the temperament and the plan to keep America safe in a very dangerous world, which leads, I think, to the answer to your question. More than anything else, I think these candidates need to communicate that they have a clear understanding of the threat we face in the Chinese Communist Party, the scale and scope of this threat, why this isn't just a matter of some obscure territorial disputes in the South China Sea. This is indeed a global competition. The CCP has global ambitions. What happens in Xinjiang, what happens in Beijing is not going to stay there. They are intent on exporting their model of total techno-totalitarian control, which leads to the second point, that you need to find a way to contrast that threat to the enduring and inherently superior American values. And I do believe that this is a contest between two fundamentally incompatible systems of government, and it's unlike anything we've seen since, of course, the old Cold War. So communicating the stakes, communicating who we're dealing with in the nature of a Marxist, Leninist regime that will stop at nothing to ensure that they survive at the expense of their own people, and that is the enemy of freedom around the world is the most important thing. In fact, I would say even more important than any particular policy position is just communicating that understanding of the threat and the prioritization of the threat, a recognition that as president, the most important issue that you will be dealing with as commander in chief is how to deter a war with the CCP in the short term and win a new Cold War with the CCP over the long term.
So let's put that in the form of a question for Bret and Martha, because I think you're right. I am looking at, of course, I've always looked at every one of these debates as an audition to be commander in chief. Eventually there comes a choice with the Democrat, but right now, when I vote in the Virginia primary, I will vote based on who will be the best commander in chief. And because that's what matters. 9/11 matters. What does W do on 9/11? That matters. What does W do vis-a-vis Afghanistan and Iraq? What does anyone do on any moment of crisis? What do they do in the Situation Room? Figuring out how to elicit that about China is a difficult thing. So you've been doing nothing but this for 6 months, right? And by the way, recap for our audience of Pittsburgh Steelers fans what you have been doing for 6 months, because they may never have heard of the Select Committee. This might be the first day they're listening to the audience. No acronyms or $5 in the tip jar for Food for the Poor.
Well, the Speaker of the House created the Select Committee on the CCP to do two things. One is to communicate why this matters, why anybody in Northeast Wisconsin or Pittsburgh or Ohio should care about the threat posed by the CCP, to shine a light on all the things that they're doing, whether it's threatening to invade Taiwan, whether it's establishing illegal police stations on American soil, whether it's infiltrating American universities or attempting to build spy bases in our near abroad, to explain why it matters and why your average American should care about it. The second thing is to identify policies and pieces of legislation that can pass even in divided government. In the 118th Congress, what is the center of gravity in terms of steps that we can take in order to put ourselves on a better position to beat the CCP in this short and long-term competition? So that's what we've been doing. We've broken it down essentially, as though this isn't a perfect organization, into three main lines of effort. And I do think this reflects our overall lines of effort. Our grand strategy against China basically has three main components. One is military competition. What are the things we need to do to deter a war over Taiwan in the near term, as well as ensure that we maintain our dominant military position over the long term? The second is what I call economic statecraft. How do we selectively decouple from China so they don't have a coercive leverage over us, so they can't threaten, for example, to cut off the export of advanced pharmaceutical ingredients in order to bring us to our knees? And then the third line of effort is what I call ideological warfare or ideological competition, which is not only how do we rediscover a language for talking about American values and incorporate values and human rights back into American grand strategy, but also how do we better defend our institutions from Chinese Communist Party subversion, from something called United Front work, from traditional espionage, things like that, so we aren't corrupted and divided from within, which is what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do. Wang Huning, who's Xi Jinping's top lieutenant, in the 90s wrote a book called America Against America, in which he talks about Americans as greedy, factional, and that title, America Against America, I think reflects their overall strategy, which is to divide Americans against Americans and thereby make it impossible for us to compete. So we've been developing policy recommendations along each of those lines. We've put out two reports, one on military competition, one related to human rights, and we're going to be putting out further reports. So, I think those are useful starting points for candidates who want to prepare for a debate in terms of where's Congress at on this issue, where's the bipartisan center of gravity, where can you potentially build on some of our work. But that's what we've been doing for 6 months. It's trying to understand and explain the threat, and then identify policy solutions that help us to combat that threat.
How would you put that in the form of a question by Bret or Martha?
Well, there's the overall prioritization question. What is the biggest threat to American national security, which is a bit boring, but is a useful starting point.
Stop. That's not boring. That is the question, isn't it? Shouldn't that just be asked? What is the number one threat to American national security and why? Shouldn't that be it?
That's table stakes, right? That's a good diagnostic question. And then it also allows the candidates, if they want to use their full time, and I forget how much time they get, to really articulate the key distinction between them and the Biden administration. Because if you read the Biden administration's national security strategy, there they talk about China as a pacing threat. Although I'm hearing now that the Pentagon is saying, don't say pacing threat, say pacing challenge or competitor because we obviously don't want to provoke the CCP for whatever reason. I've described this as kind of like a Voldemort phenomenon. There's this belief that the more we say things like New Cold War or say that the CCP is doing bad things, that it will somehow become more true, which I think is absurd.
I'll be right back. Chairman Gallagher is going to stay with me through the break, and then we're going to bring him back, and then we're going to do that again because we're going to talk to him for 50 minutes this morning about this. I can't believe I'm doing that. 50 minutes with Mike Gallagher. Coming right at you, America. Stay tuned. I'm back now with Chairman Mike Gallagher. This is the segment between the radio segments, so you don't get to hear this unless you're watching it on YouTube or on the television station. Chairman, in terms of what level should we expect of our candidates' knowledge? I see your Green Bay Packers thing. Do you know the Browns cleared $38 million in cap yesterday by restructuring Joel Bitonio and Myles Garrett's contract? We have the most cap space in the NFL. We are the team to beat. We will see you. I don't think you're making it to the Super Bowl this year. We are going to be in the Super Bowl this year, and you are not ready for this. I'm glad this isn't on the air because this is a serious conversation. But you had to do that little thing, and I'll just go get my brown sweater and just put it on during this segment like that. I'm going to wear this all the time now on the air because we're going to the Super Bowl, Chairman. Do you know that we cleared Myles Garrett contract yesterday? Do you know what we do? Do you follow sports at all, or do you just do Chi-Com stuff?
I don't follow Brown's contract minutia. I'll confess that, though. I was yesterday. Someone said that I had the potential to coach for the Browns after I helped them with a constituent case issue. To which I said, I would never coach for the Browns. What an insult!
All right, let me get serious again.
I'm already going off the rails.
The breakup, off the rail. Let's get back on the rails. How many times have you guys held public hearings?
Gosh, I think 10 at this point, approximately 10. Yeah.
You had at least one set of war games. You have more war games coming.
We do. We have at least one more coming up that's going to be more focused on economic and supply chain issues.
Okay. Do you think the candidates know anything about this? I really do want to try and use today to focus their attention on China. Do you think they know anything about what the Select Committee has been doing? Have you been approached by any of them?
I think some do. It's part of the reason I wrote an op-ed on this that appeared today in the Wall Street Journal. It just came out, was an effort, maybe shamelessly, to draw attention to some of the things we're doing, because I think it creates some unique opportunities. I mean, to me, the most, and this reflects my bias in thinking that hard power is the most important variable on the world stage. I think a candidate who can articulate what we need to do to rebuild the military in general, but really the Navy in particular, which is, as you know, Hugh, is really struggling right now. It needs to be our priority force in our priority theater. It's not. We're going backwards. There's questions about focus, warfighting prowess. I wrote a report with the help of Admiral Montgomery about the lack of warfighting focus in the surface Navy with Tom Cotton, Dan Crenshaw, and others. I mean, I think that's a massive opportunity for a candidate really to take the ball in defense and go a few layers deep beyond just peace through strength, military good, China bad. You go a few layers deep on that and sort of communicate that you have a coherent plan. It doesn't need to be super detailed. Doesn't need to be a 50-page white paper about everything we need to do, but just an overall strategy for fixing the Pentagon.
Chairman, I'm going to get your comms team in trouble again. I haven't seen this plan that you and Cotton worked on. How can I not have seen this plan?
Well, this was a year ago. You got to blame Cotton's comms team for this because he was in the lead. Okay. And usually it's good to blame Tom Cotton for everything.
He's on next hour. I'll do that. Is that widely available?
Yeah, it's Cotton did it with four of us in the House. It was over a year and a half ago, kind of in response to all of these ship collisions, some of the reports that we were getting from active duty sailors, and just the changes over the years to training in the surface Navy. We did a deep dive drawing on the expertise of Admiral Montgomery and others in order to.
I will gig him about that in the next hour, and I'll get a link and I'll make sure it's on posted out to the candidates. Don't go anywhere. I'm coming right back with Chairman Gallagher. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Chairman Mike Gallagher of the House Select Committee on Engagement with the Chinese Communist Party returns. We talked during the break and we got off course because we did a little football trash talk, but now we're back on course. Chairman Gallagher, have you read this book yet, Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the Warriors Who Fought to the End? It made me furious. It absolutely made me furious. Have you had a chance to read it yet?
No, but my friend Commander Salamander, who's great and whose podcast Midrats I highly recommend, just did a podcast with the authors. So I listened to it. It's not the same, but I'm now looking forward to reading the actual hard copy.
Well, the end of the book, which I don't know if Commander Salamander got to because I didn't get to it and I talked to him for a long time, is about how the Chi-Coms came in as soon as we left. They have designs on Bagram. They know what the air raids mean. They know what the strategic minerals mean. It's just a great example of what happens when we retreat in the world. In fact, in the This Kind of War book you had me read, I wrote down some notes. A retreat once started as the most difficult of all human actions to reverse. And they were talking about the retreat of the Norks at that point, and then we would retreat later when they counterattack with the Chi-Coms. But we retreated from Afghanistan, and they have come in. Have you focused yet on what they're doing there?
It hasn't been, admittedly, a subject of a hearing. We have experts, regional experts and Afghanistan experts. I think the key thing, to bring it back to the presidential debate, the obvious thing to do is to connect the surrender to terrorists in Afghanistan, our abandonment of our position, our abandonment of billions of dollars worth of military equipment, to then the collapse of deterrence in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, because I do believe that our feckless position in Afghanistan sent a clear signal of weakness to Vladimir Putin. And no wonder Vladimir Putin ignored all of our warnings leading up to the invasion on February 24th, because we looked so weak on the world stage. And we allowed terrorists to completely take over the country. And I think also that has had a negative impact on our deterrent posture in the Indo-Pacific across the Taiwan Strait. You mentioned critical minerals. I also think this is a huge opportunity for presidential candidates to articulate a plausible path towards reducing our dependency on China for critical mineral processing. They control 90% of the processing. Right now, I think our attempts to wean ourselves off of to establish some form of semiconductor manufacturing independence are not going to be successful, in part because the Biden administration has placed so many onerous regulations on grants for chips fabrication facilities. But if a Republican candidate, particularly one with a business background or with a gubernatorial background, came in and said, here's our strategy when it comes to advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, critical minerals, and rare earth processing, tie that to a robust domestic economic agenda, that's a massive opportunity for someone trying to pass the commander-in-chief test. Because the reality is we are going to have to reclaim our economic independence from China in key areas. The progressives are experimenting with one way to do it. We need to identify a way that is fundamentally free market, but nonetheless achieves the actual goal of reducing our dependency on China.
Chairman Gallagher, there's only one veteran on the stage, Ron DeSantis. Mike Pence has got a son and a son-in-law on active duty. And of course, Nikki Haley's husband is deployed. Those three know about this. In terms of why is China a threat, is it a fair question to ask? Why is China a threat? What is it that worries you about China? Is that a fair question? If so, how would you answer that or suggest they answer that if you're one of the people on the stage?
Well, first of all, I do think DeSantis has been really good on China and probably the best in the field. I was watching the forum that they did in Iowa. I forget what it was called, the Iowa Faith and Family Forum. And he proactively brought up China as an issue and talked about what he's done in Florida to combat the threat, talked about the threat in global terms. And so though most of the discussion focused on Ukraine, and I understand that that's more of a politically divisive issue on the stage. And so there is I think the moderators will want to identify the differences between the candidate. Thus far, Governor DeSantis has been talking in clear and unapologetic language about why the CCP is a threat and what he would do to combat it, which is greatly appreciated. More to your point, as a Navy veteran, I think he has a huge opportunity to be the Navy guy, be the guy who's going to rebuild the Navy and put it in a position where it can deter Xi Jinping from attempting to achieve his lifelong ambition, was to take Taiwan by force. So to answer your question,
but Vivek just told me last week, we'll give them Taiwan after we achieve semiconductor independence. In other words, Vivek understands Taiwan is important for its semiconductor. Your colleague on the committee, Ro Khanna, tweeted at me last night when I was already offline that doesn't do the trick. That's not why we're worried about Taiwan going down. Who's right?
Well, obviously, our interests in Taiwan extend far beyond semiconductors. Our interests predate Taiwan's emergence as a semiconductor powerhouse. And if the concern from Vivek, and I think it is, that our dependence on TSMC for semiconductor manufacturing needs to be eliminated, I just would say two things. It's highly unlikely that we're going to achieve semiconductor independence by 2028. TSMC is investing far more money than the CHIPS Act is investing right now. Even under a Republican president, we would struggle to wean ourselves off our dependency. But if the CCP had control of Taiwan, they would still be able to hold the rest of the world economically hostage. And that is the issue. Semiconductors or some sort of domain of economic competition, if they had Taiwan, they would be able to completely dominate the region through which trillions of dollars of international trade go. The other thing I would say is,
wait, we got to go to break. I'll come back. So I'm back with Chairman Gallagher. Chairman, Vivek's answer to that is, I'm going to get India to cooperate, and if Taiwan closes the Taiwan Straits, we're going to close the Malacca Straits. Ro Khanna says that's crazy. That doesn't work. I don't know what the answer is, but I know what Vivek has told me. I don't think he agrees with you, but I'll let him speak for himself. I don't want to put words in his mouth, that we have to worry that much about the Taiwan Strait.
Well, he's obviously very smart. I would say this, with Marxist-Leninist regimes, their appetites grow with the eating. So I think it would be a mistake to think that if we just surrender Taiwan on a date certain, that we wouldn't have to worry about the problem. If they're the dominant regional power, they're one step closer to becoming the dominant global power. And that, I think, is the answer to your earlier question. Why is the CCP a threat? Because they're trying to destroy our geopolitical position, primarily by convincing us to destroy ourselves. They believe, as we mince words about whether they're a competitor or an adversary, they certainly believe that they're in an existential war with the free world led by America, and that China will win, rendering America and our constitutional system of self-government subordinate, humiliated, and wholly irrelevant on the world stage. So you can sort of think of it as an assisted suicide. They're trying to expedite our collapse. They provide the chemicals, fentanyl, the collapse in prosperity, COVID, IP theft, economic warfare, and the self-loathing and depression via political interference and information warfare. So I think the threat would not stop after Xi Jinping had taken Taiwan. I think it would only expedite and become greater.
So what if you could read Xi Jinping's mind? What is he thinking about us? What does he want to see happen to us?
I think he wants us to look inward and to abandon our position on the world stage and to be consumed with internal political battles. I also think he likes seeing us embrace this almost the CCP's narrative that America is an evil country, America is a neo-colonial racist hellscape. I mean, this is CCP propaganda that a lot of Americans have embraced. And I think ultimately he wants us to lose faith in ourselves as a force for good in the world. And ultimately, over time, he thinks the rest of the world is going to Finlandize more in the CCP's direction as an alternative model of government and world leadership, in part because America has lost faith in itself. That's why I think primarily, though hard power is the most important variable, this is an ideological competition overall. And ignoring the role ideology plays in the competition is a fatal flaw. And so we need to find a way to press the candidates on that as well.
You know, we got 2 minutes before we come back. The ideological competition is quite simply not discussed. And I don't think our media is familiar with it. They're not stupid. They're ignorant of the ideological. They don't even believe it exists anymore, Chairman. Have you run into that? Do your Democratic colleagues believe that there are such things like Leninists and that the 20th century's ideological competition is back with a vengeance?
Well, I think for 2.5 decades, we tried to take the communist out of Chinese Communist Party. And this belief persists that, well, they're not really communists. They're not really Marxists. They've embraced forms of capitalism and they're rational actors. And I think this is a dangerous way of thinking to go down, particularly under Xi Jinping. The party has embraced its Marxist-Leninist roots. Xi's spirit animal is, in fact, Stalin. He looks to Stalin for guidance on how to operate. And so a candidate who understands that and can articulate that, I think, has a massive opportunity to distinguish themselves. The Democrats sort of come at the ideological competition through human rights, and there are a lot who genuinely believe in the cause of human rights. And though there are times when we have to prioritize between security concerns and human rights, this is when dealing with China, that's not an issue at all.
We're coming right back. Stand by, Chairman. Welcome back. This is part 5 of my interview with Chairman Gallagher this morning. And Mr. Chairman, I want to focus again, like a laser. What should Martha and Bret be asking? If I were king of the forest, not queen, not duke, not earl, I'd spend the entire debate on China because it's our number one existential threat. Every other threat is a bullet point underneath it. And you mentioned during the break fentanyl, for example. John Ellis has terrorism coming out of Afghanistan this morning as a threat. The economic collapse that China is undergoing in their real estate market will impact our markets eventually. But it's all under the heading of CCP. So I would make it a CCP debate. But it's not going to be that. They're going to end up talking about the former president, they're going to talk about the justice system, they're going to talk about all sorts of things that are hot button issues. If you get 3 questions and 3 follow-ups, and you start with, say, Governor DeSantis, and you bounce, you go to Governor Christie, and you bounce after that, and you go to Nikki Haley, what are the 3 questions?
Well, in the context of perhaps China has not been a big issue just because the candidates perceive Trump to be tough on China and don't want to fight on ground that's favorable to him. I think that's a mistake. This is an opportunity to get out of Trump's shadow. And there are things that the president did that I think you can disagree with on China. His administration was divided in many cases. Treasury was more dovish. The phase 1 trade deal did not realize its promise. The CCP committed to expanding purchases of U.S. exports by $200 billion. And like many a communist promise, that went unfulfilled. And Trump has praised Xi Jinping recently. So I just say that because I don't think candidates should hesitate to embrace this opportunity. 3 questions. And I think these are kind of the wedge issues in the Republican Party right now. I'm sort of putting aside the things that I think most of the candidates agree upon. Let's start what we were just talking about. What is your plan for deterring an invasion of Taiwan in the near term and rebuilding the U.S. military over the long term? What specifically will you do? How will you succeed where your predecessors have failed? And in the Trump administration, we made a down payment on readiness, but we did not actually rebuild the military. So what are you going to do to address the most pressing national security crisis? Because the next commander-in-chief is going to have to deal with likely the 4th Taiwan Strait crisis. And if you examine the previous 3, it took a whole lot of presidential fortitude and creativity to diffuse those situations and prevent them from escalating into World War III. And that's what we're dealing with. The second question I would say is related to this question of outbound capital flows. What restrictions should we place on American money going to China, particularly as the Chinese economy slows down and they start to deal with a real estate crisis, a demographic issue? The Wall Street voices are going to grow louder saying that, well, we don't need any restrictions on U.S. capital. But as are the CCP committee's recently launched investigation on BlackRock and MSCI has revealed, Wall Street is funneling American capital into at least 6 different companies Chinese companies on 6 different U.S. government blacklists. And these companies are building things like stealth fighter jets, aircraft carriers, artillery shells, advanced nuclear technology. So we are making the retirement health of millions of Americans dependent on the success of the Chinese Communist Party's project militarily and in terms of their Orwellian techno-totalitarian surveillance state. But some Republicans want no restrictions. They're more sympathetic to the Wall Street view. Others, like me, argue for a more intense set of restrictions so that we don't increase our dependency on China and we don't subsidize our own destruction. I think we should ask the presidential candidates, how can we stop Wall Street from putting our service members in danger, subsidizing our own destruction, or funding the CCP's ongoing genocide in Xinjiang? And then third, I would say the issue of TikTok a few months ago was front and center. It's fallen off the radar in part because of an aggressive and expensive lobbying campaign on behalf of TikTok. But the issue still remains, which is that if we allow TikTok to become the dominant media company in America, we're allowing a CCP-controlled company to have that type of influence. It's like as if we allowed in the early 1960s, right before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Pravda and the KGB to purchase the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, and NBC. Trump tried to ban TikTok or force a sale. That ran into a legal buzzsaw. The Biden administration seems to have backed off for fear of alienating young progressive voters. Legislative action has stalled because the Senate effort was viewed as too broad, and it got attacked by conservative commentators, and so people are a bit skittish right now. But we have to figure out this issue of Chinese-controlled applications operating in the United States and this broader issue of cross-border data flow. So that might be a little bit in the weeds, but it is so important to understand what we're going to do and succeed where we failed in the past. So those would be my three candidates. If you want to go a layer deeper beyond the overall prioritization, who's the biggest threat issue, those are areas where I know there's disagreement in the Republican field, and therefore a big opportunity for someone to distinguish themselves in the commander-in-chief test.
I want to land our plane on AI and Goldwater Nichols. By that meaning, I've spent a lot of time in the last 72 to 96 hours trying to read fast on artificial intelligence, self-generative capabilities because of some interviews I did last week. And it is rather an astonishing technology that is being unleashed into the wild without much supervision. China is stealing whatever we make and trying to improve on it. What would you do about AI, and do it in the context of, do you think there is an opening for a Goldwater-Nichols style reform of the Pentagon, by which I mean, the woke stuff is important to talk about, and I get readiness. We have a trouble with recruiting, but our contracting is a mess. It's an absolute disaster, and we've got to skinny down the civilians, bolster the uniforms, and get to where we can buy things in a hurry like we did in World War II and did not do in Korea. So AI and contracting, Chairman, how would you pose that in the form of a question to these candidates?
Well, I would say, well, first of all, just let's start with what the easiest thing is. Let's stop allowing American venture capitalists to invest in Chinese AI companies. I mean, that's table stakes. That's an entry point right there. So it is bound up in this outbound capital flow issue. You shouldn't be allowed to invest in Baidu, given how central this technology is towards geopolitical competition. I don't understand why we'd be allowing American money to help the CCP beat us in the AI race. Then you get to the thornier issue, which could lend itself to a question of, how do you regulate this technology? How do we continue our aggressive push on innovation while at the same time ensuring that the technology doesn't get out of control or is used for nefarious purposes? And that's a very difficult question. The Pentagon's set of ethical guardrails around AI use are actually decent. They're actually a good starting point. So if we can build upon those, and if we can expand those throughout the federal government, you then have a starting point where we can start to bring our key allies on board in terms of, this is how AUKUS thinks about how best to regulate AI without destroying the innovation so the Chinese win the race. From there, you start to build out concentric circles in terms of an international consensus around ethical use of AI and beating the CCP and the Russians in the AI race. You can extend it to other close partners that are technological superpowers in the region, Japan and South Korea. You can extend it to NATO allies in particular. But I think asking these candidates about how do you both continue innovation in AI while ensuring its ethical use is a legitimate question in the context of overall CCP competition. With respect to Goldwater Nichols, I think what we're dealing with in the present day is actually the unintended consequences of Goldwater Nichols. And a lot of the things that Goldwater Nichols tried to fix, i.e., parochialism among the services, have now in the present day become a myopic focus on jointness for jointness sake, and a fetishizing of jointness. And so I actually think there's an opportunity for a smart reform of Goldwater Nichols itself in order to restore a focus on warfighting in the Pentagon. More broadly, and when you talk about the acquisition workforce numbers something like 175,000 people. That's almost the size of the United States Marine Corps. Overall, the largest branch of the U.S. military is DoD civilians. It's much bigger than the Army. It's over 800,000 people. So a candidate who can articulate the fact that we need to rebalance our so-called tooth-to-tail ratio, reduce the number of DoD civilians, reduce, I would argue, the overall number of general and flag officers, and surge those resources down to the tooth, down to the pointy end of the spear. I think you can communicate that in a way that resonates with the American people. I would go even further and say the Pentagon owns a bunch of real estate assets, golf courses, and other things that it doesn't need. It could recycle those assets and instead use that money to spend on weapons. Ultimately, however, and this is where the commander-in-chief test comes in, if we take the lessons of Secretary Gates and the MRAP, or take any successful recent program amidst the growing Pentagon bureaucracy, what it does require is not only Secretary of Defense prioritization, but the support of the commander-in-chief. Unless the commander-in-chief prioritizes this, the bureaucracy in the Pentagon is going to win and swallow whoever tries to tame it. It is going to require the focus of the next president. That's why we don't have a bigger Navy. That's why we don't have a more lethal Navy. We haven't had that consistent focus on American sea power and someone who is willing to say to the defense industrial base, okay, we are going to be building 2.5 Virginia-class subs a year. We're going to be replenishing all of our stockpiles of long-range precision fires over the next 5 years so that the CCP doesn't think it can take Taiwan. Here is our actual shipbuilding plan, not just in distant 30-year plans that mean nothing when they arrive, but this is what we're going to do this year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. I'm going to hold you accountable for your targets, and then put that in a broader context of here is our plan for workforce recruitment so that we can actually build these ships. The final thing I'd say, I'm knowing going on, the next commander-in-chief will, of course, face a massive recruitment crisis unlike anything we've seen in recent memory, which is why I think every service secretary, the Secretary of Defense, and the president of himself needs to get into the business of recruiting, persuading young men and women that they have a duty and an opportunity to serve their country and that is a noble calling. It's going to take that level of leadership to fix our recruitment crisis.
Chairman Gallagher, we're out of time. That was a great primer. I appreciate the extra amount of time this morning. That'll be posted at hughhewitt.com on my YouTube channel as well. And I hope every candidate watches it before tomorrow night. Thank you, Chairman Gallagher. I want to remind all of you, even with your Green Bay Packers propaganda, thank you for doing that.